Okay, welcome everyone to this legal office hours. Today's topic, licensing and regulatory issues when buying a business. My name is Will Smith. I'm the host of the podcast Acquiring Minds. Attorneys James David Williams and Bill Barlow are going to host this session. James David and Bill are partners in Barlow and Williams, a practice specializing in small business M&A. They're at the front lines of the market. Their focus is helping searchers and sponsors like you do your deals. They also represent sellers, so they see both sides of transactions in this market. This is their 10th office hours with Acquiring Minds, all different topics. You should go back and watch their other sessions, which are all recorded and available on the Acquiring Minds website. I'm going to post links there in a sec. Huge amount of value in this body of webinars that James David and Bill have given over the last 10-ish months. We run these by James David and Bill giving their presentation first, and then we'll do Q&A. To ask a question, use the Q&A function of Zoom. So you're not using chat, you're not using raise your hand, you're looking for that Q&A button. Sometimes we get questions from audience members that are very detailed, very in the weeds of like a live deal. Difficult to answer those publicly because they can be so specific, but ask it anyway, because James David and Bill can follow up with you after the webinar to get that answered. That may be particularly relevant today because, of course, in licensing and regulation, there's a lot of state-by-state stuff. So ask the question, and if it feels like it has a broad appeal, we'll ask it. Otherwise, they'll follow up with you afterwards. We're recording, so you'll all receive a link to this recording by email in the next day or two. And let me give you those links to all of these past 9 webinars in the chat. There's the first 5. Here's the next 4. So you have 9 links there. And then finally connect with Bill and James David. Here's their website and their LinkedIn and their emails. So go ahead and connect with them on LinkedIn, and that's how you can reach them with a question or to set up a call. Okay, guys, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Will. We'll bring up the presentation. So today, just as a broad overview, we're going to be talking about licenses and permits. So a lot of businesses don't require licenses and permits. Anybody can go out, do the work, charge the client, sell the product, whatever it is. But a lot of businesses in this country do require some type of license or permit in order to perform the service or sell the product. And so a lot of times these are appealing because there's a certain degree of a moat, right? You have to have this in order to engage in the business. But it also comes with challenges because you need to make sure that you fulfill this, and not only from the legal standpoint, but you also have to think of it from the operational standpoint. Like, even if you legally can operate this business, with dragging a license holder and kind of trying to rent them or something like that, that might not be a tenable business strategy, even if it's technically legal. So we're going to cover both aspects of this, and yeah, let's just jump right into it.
So a little bit about us. I know Bill kind of jumped in, but I'll do the more general spiel. We're Barlow and Williams. We're a 2-person M&A law firm. At this point, that is all that we do. Represent buyers and sellers. We use flat fees for all of our engagements and milestone-based payments. Let me add a little bit to what Will said earlier. If you do ask a question, make sure that you're not anonymous. If you're anonymous, I can't follow up with you later. And if you are anonymous and realize it, maybe just send your email right after your question. But either way, I actually do respond to all the questions. So people are always surprised that I do that, but I do. So we'll go to the first slide here. All right, so we'll just kind of start with kind of greatest hits, if you will, of the type of businesses where licensing, permits, regulatory approvals can be an issue. The biggest categories are like anything in construction, right? And then anything in the trades, and that's sort of broad, right? I think we had one bill, it was a landscape design firm that actually needed a contractor, a GC license because they did the landscape installation. So like this is kind of broad that applies. So, there are businesses that actually need these licenses that you may not even realize when you first look at the listings. Professional services is one where, like, at least in North Carolina where we are, right? If you're not an attorney, you couldn't even pretend to, right? You couldn't buy our law firm. You have to be an attorney to own a law firm in this state, right? So there can be things like that. Healthcare can have similar things. We have some stories about that too. And then in government contracting, right? Sometimes there can be certain businesses, right? You as the owner would have to have a security clearance in order to do those or things like that. But it can also be things like restaurants. Got a restaurant deal right now where a liquor license is a material part of the restaurant business, right? So a lot of different types of businesses are going to have something. This is not always true, but a lot of them have something, and you need to address that.
Guys, could I jump in with a question already? Because I think
Yeah.
it's an important, others, if they have it, pre-question to this presentation, which is, what states do you have expertise in when it comes to regulations and licensing? Person who asks happens to be in Texas. Does it matter? How does that play out?
So how it will work is that we will do research on the state specific requirement. So you don't have to necessarily be we don't have to be licensed in the state in order to help you navigate some of the issues in that state. Now, that being said, a lot of times, we're M&A generalists. We don't necessarily know what an electrician license is required in Iowa, right? It's just not always, within our knowledge base. But number one, we can research it. And number two, often the seller will already have somebody they've worked with on, whatever compliance requirements are needed there. So we guide you through the process, even if we don't directly know the answer, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and if necessary, we would find local counsel in the relevant jurisdiction to help.
So really, you can help with transactions in any states where regulations and licensing across all 50.
Yes, we work with businesses all over the country with acquisitions. So,
yeah,
thank you.
Some states I wish I didn't have to work with, but
we might charge a premium for some of them. But I think this discussion of these different types of businesses also goes into the next question, which is, are you the right buyer for the business? And I want to give two examples. One's kind of a positive example and one's sort of a more negative example, just to kind of get you some flavor. So I'll start with the positive one. So we helped someone who bought an electrician business, and they had a lot of experience in the construction industry. And so before it was an asset purchase, before the deal was done, they set up their entity and were able to get the license they needed in order to run that business. And then day one, that entity was licensed. They were able to practice and basically continue on the business smoothly going forward. So that's an example of someone where somebody has that background. Now, I'm not saying you have to have the relevant industry background in every case, but it's obviously helpful. I want to give another example that's sort of on the other end of the spectrum, which is something we've commonly come across, which is not commonly, but we have on occasion seen people who might be investment bankers that graduated college, spent 2 years at an investment bank, and then came to us and says, we are looking to buy an accounting practice, a 2-person accounting practice that are just 2 accountants in Scottsdale, Arizona. And they had these ideas of doing this large roll-up of accounting practices. And I had a conversation with them very frankly. I'm like, well, if you buy this, how do you feel about being an accountant in Scottsdale, Arizona? Because that's what buying this 2-person accounting business is going to entail. And their kind of eyes glazed over. They're like, no, we really don't want to be accountants in Scottsdale, Arizona. And it's like, well, then in that case, this is probably not the right business for you. And so, some of the questions you should ask yourself is like, what is the nature of the scale of this business, right? Like, is this really a business that has more passive incomes? Or is this more of a job where people are, providing a service and receiving a lot of compensation, but they have to be providing the service in order to get that money? And if you're not able to step into that role and be the service provider, you might find yourself in a very difficult position where you're just not able to run the business fundamentally. And that gets into kind of the second point, which is, I think a lot of people want to solve this problem by saying, well, maybe I'm not the license holder, but a key employee can be the license holder. That will often work from a legal perspective. But once again, I think you need to ask yourself, are you setting yourself up to be held hostage if everything is reliant on one person who is not you? And it's also different if your plan is to get the license and maybe use that as a bridge. If your plan is not to do that and to be completely passive, and you're only relying on one person to hold the license, you're just putting yourself in a very tricky situation. So you need to kind of keep some of those things in mind. And that kind of goes to the third point about how vulnerable is a business to employee attrition. If that one employee that holds the license decides to leave and you can no longer operate the business, that's a potential problem. And it's something that's worth considering.
And this is more commonly an issue in the trades, or either in the trades or in professional services, and for searchers, right? If you're a sponsor, you're buying a bigger business, this is going to be less of an issue because you're going to have additional layers of people. But this is much more common in the searchers, in the trades, and professional services, right? There's a real difference in buying a job and buying a business in this sense. And you can buy a job and buy a great job, right? Those can be great acquisitions. But if that's what the business indeed is, then you need to understand that and you need to be able to do it. That's also why, businesses that have multiple, distributed providers and multiple layers of middle management trade at higher multiples, right? So it opens up the buyer pool more. So those are more expensive.
Can we assume, guys, that any kind of searcher story or deal that you have going on that is a trades business, maybe not where there's some expertise, HVAC, plumbing, electrical being, the big 3, that this is the format where there's a single person in that organization who has the license, because the searcher is not going to, becoming qualified for a license for those more specialized trades is not something a searcher can go do. It takes years. So it's always the case that in any of these stories that an employee is the sole license holder?
Not always. There are some where 3 or 4 employees will hold the relevant licenses or be in line to get them, right? There's some of them that have apprentices, and right, they have multiple levels with some of these licenses. So there are some where it's 3 or 4 people have what they need to operate for the business to continue operating. And that's a different story, right? Where the biggest risk is if the seller is the license holder, right? And then there's sort of a lower level risk of like, okay, now instead of that, there's one key employee who does, right? Because, I won't say, Bill said hold hostage, but maybe a little bit strong, but that person has a lot of negotiating leverage if they know that the business can't operate without them, So you need to at
Yeah.
least expect to compensate them for that.
And the other thing to keep in mind is you need to know how easy to replace these individuals are, right? The easier it is for you to swap out and get new people if that relationship deteriorates, the more comfortable you can be. But especially for instance, if not only is it licensed, but they're doing something that's pretty specialized, you might be in a situation where there's not that many people that can actually functionally do that job. And like at that point, you really have to be asking yourself, like, what is a replacement? You might say there's a lot of people that do HVAC. I'm comfortable that I can find another license holder to do the HVAC and I'll be able to switch them out. As long as you're comfortable that there's enough depth in that market that you're not going to be caught out, that might be fine. But again, you have to assess each market and how many of those people are out there to make sure you don't get into a tricky situation.
And are licenses always held by an individual within an organization, never by the business entity itself?
No, there can be, and this is where can be huge variance state to state. But no, some of these licenses will be held by the entity. Okay. And then some are both, right? There's some scenarios where you have to, like the business holds a license, but in order to continue to qualify for that license, the employees also have to have this other license. So it gets, devil's in the details. But no, there can be licenses or permits or certifications, right, that are held by an entity, right, where there could be a manufacturing business, right, that has certain safety certifications that it has obtained, right. Those are going to be held by the manufacturer, by the company. So
right.
Yeah, but even in the
Thank you.
trades, the answer is not uniform. Okay, and then since, as I said, right, there's not a lot of uniformity in some of this, right? These licensing points, permitting points can be very important as part of the diligence. This is often some of the earlier diligence items that we will focus on from a legal perspective, even. And so the easiest thing is to start by asking the seller, like, what licenses do you have, you, the entity, and all of your employees, right? That's a good place to start. That can't be the end because, as it turns out, sometimes people actually need more permits or licenses than they have, but whoops. But it does happen. But, really drilling into what licenses are needed, who holds them, can they be transferred, right? That's an important point. If say the entity holds a license, can you transfer it to another entity, or does there have to be some sort of recertification process, right? And again, right, we'll raise it up here again. Like if it's individuals who are holding the licenses, what's the plan, right? Because if they're truly key people, you need to have a plan to keep them. If you're doing a seller, if the seller is the license holder, right? It may be, you may even be able to get a bank to okay it. Like a lot of banks won't, right? A lot of banks, even if there is a license holder who's not the seller, there are a lot of banks who will still really diligence you hard on what your plan is around license succession. So you need to have a plan. That's the biggest thing about this.
And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that there these are kind of coming from two separate places. So we had one deal where the broker kind of presented this opportunity, and it seemed like this great opportunity, and our potential client came to us and says, hey, I want to buy this company. We looked into it, and it was a company that you had to have some type of psychology degree in that state in order to run that business. And the reality is that the brokers do not often do their diligence. Often they do not do the diligence that's required. And so in that case, it was just a flat out no. Like, you cannot run this business because you have to have this requirement that you do not have, because you do not have that license and educational background. More commonly, well, not more commonly, but oftentimes the issue is not necessarily the state requirement, but it's often the lender's requirements. So even if, for instance, the example that James David gave, even if the seller is willing to stay on as, the license holder, first of all, SBA lending will often say if the seller is not retaining equity, they're not able to stay longer for 12 months. And so what are you going to do after the 12 months? And then secondly, the lender, even if you do give them some equity and allow them to stay on, the lender might say, I'm sorry, but I'm not comfortable with that risk. You're dependent on the seller. You've just given them a big check. They're 70 something years old and they want to retire. And I don't feel comfortable with your with your plan to just have them as the license holder, because at some point during the term of the loan, they're not going to be there anymore. And I don't understand what your plan is at that point. So just keep in mind that even if you can get past what is the actual license requirements, you might not be able to get past the requirements that you're going to see from the lender.
And I'll just add, like, if your lender is worried about this, then you should be too. Right? The lender has a whole, if they've been doing SBA loans long enough, right? They have a lot of data on these. There is data. So like if the lender is concerned about a lack of succession for a license, then you should be too, from a business perspective.
There's also actually one other thing that we haven't brought up, but I think it might be worthwhile to mention. In government contracts specifically, there are often, or have been in the past, mandates for either minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses. Now, with the new administration, some of this is a little bit more in the air, but you still have that often at a city statewide level. So it's something to keep in mind if you are buying a business, especially if they have government contracts. Is that a certification they have? Is that a certification you will have once you are the buyer? Because if you don't meet those requirements and they're getting all this business because they have that, that's going to be a problem, going forward. So something you don't often think of when you think of licensing requirements, but also something to kind of keep in the back of the mind.
Yeah. So turning to how the licensing can impact the deal structure, the most common way that it impacts things is that if a business entity holds a license and that license can't be transferred, right, then you may have to do a stock sale or an equity purchase of some kind. And this could be something as simple as a restaurant having a liquor license, which is a situation I'm dealing with right now, actually. But this is why one of the reasons, like, who holds the license matters, right? And why we brought that up in the diligence piece a couple of minutes ago. Could also be that the seller, that there is some seller role in order to keep the owner as license holder in place, but that realistically is a stopgap measure at most, as Bill talked about, because even if you are doing that, right, there needs to be a plan to very quickly get a new license holder in place, just to avoid the risks, right? You have the risk, what if the hypothetical bus runs them over, right? Then you're in trouble, right? So if you are thinking about a seller role of some kind as a way to handle the license, right? Again, succession plan, succession plan, succession plan. Okay, end of the presentation. Bill, you have anything else on this bit?
No, I think that's it. We're happy to answer questions. Again, we're Barlow and Williams. We're a flat fee M&A law firm. We work with searchers, buyers, and sellers. And yeah, would love to field any questions you have. And also, by the way, I'll just mention, this is also meant to be an open office hour. So if you do have a legal question that's not specifically on licensing on permits, you could feel free to ask that in the chat as well, because that's, a common thing that we often deal with. So.
Great. Thank you, guys. Great information as always. Already 10 questions to hit you with, and I'm sure more will come. Okay. How does a layperson or a searcher research license requirements? Is there a best practice here, or a uniform answer, or is it the feared "it depends"?
Well, it's going to be, it depends, but I will say that some of the AI enhanced search tools are getting better at this. All right, so you can run a few searches and try to get a sense, but again, work with people who actually do it, because even where the licensing requirements are found, right? It could be federal, it could be state, it could be county, it could be city. Right? There's all these different possibilities, and so even if you know all the requirements in a state, if you're in New York City, there's additional stuff that's specific to the city.
Yeah.
So
The other thing I'll say is that the seller, I mean, they're the ones that often have run this business for 20 years and often have a very good degree. And so, you can get from searching and other stuff an overview, just probably enough to know, is this something that I might be able to get into? But once you get into the actual weeds of this particular licenses, almost always the seller will be your best resource. And they will often have, so right now I'm working on a deal where the seller, basically has their person to help with certain environmental permits that they need to run their manufacturing business, right? And that's their specialist. And you go to that specialist and you kind of, work with them and say, hey, I'm going to do a deal. How would this usually work? And so that's very common as well, that the seller kind of knows a guy and is able to help navigate that process.
Great. You mentioned renting a license. If I buy a trades business, what would that look like?
Well, and I kind of used it in a pejorative term, right? Ideally, if somebody's going to be providing the license, they need to have oversight to make sure that the work is being done correctly, right? Renting the license, used as a pejorative, can mean something where somebody is acting as the license holder, but is not compensated as much. So like, I'm the license holder for multiple businesses and I'm, the license holder on record. The issue I have with that, and that can be kind of renting the license. The issue I have with that is that, like, think about it in terms of the electrician's license, right? You want your electricians to do proper work in accordance with code. This is important stuff that families rely on in order to not have their home burst into flames. So you really want to make sure that if you are using somebody else to be the license holder, that they actually have enough supervision to make sure that you're doing it correctly. And that's why I would say, you know, don't just necessarily have somebody that's willing to rubber stamp things, but not really give oversight, because at the end of the day, you know, these licenses exist for a reason, and you need to make sure that you are actually in compliance.
There can also be some variation state by state and license by license as to whether such a thing is even possible. Right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of places where a license holder can only qualify a single entity, for example. Right. So you can't have this sort of qualifying 5 things. And then there are other licenses that where you can't, right? And in some states, the license holder has to be an owner of some kind in the business. Again, just there's variation here.
Just to give one example that comes to mind, I think it was Matt Jackson's episode, roofing, Florida. And his seller, I guess, for whatever reason, the seller knew another now retired guy in the roofing business who would be the license holder. And they gave this retired gentleman like 5% of the business. And so that had the benefit of it wasn't, they were more bought in. This license holder was more bought into the success of the business. On the other hand, 5% of your business can be extremely steep. So anyway, if you're interested in how one searcher did it, Matt Jackson would be the episode to look up in Acquiring Minds. So this is SBA specific, guys. So don't know, but I'm going to go for it. Is it true? Have you guys heard that as of October 24, the SBA requires that the SBA requires now, outside of any particular state, requires that the license holder be an owner. So to this point, be an owner of the business, as opposed to a consultant and employees. Do you know about the SBA requirements there, or no?
Yeah, I'd have to take a look. I mean, it's something I probably should know off the top of my head, but I do know that they have been clamping down on that, and I don't think that they have to be an owner necessarily.
There are a number of lenders who effectively have that requirement,
Right.
but I'm not sure that the SBA itself does.
Yeah. I know that I know that they I know that they've become stricter about having like basically the owner be the license holder but not own equity, but also be the license holder for like a year. And I think maybe that's what they're talking about. Because I think there used to be a little bit more wiggle room on that, and there isn't any longer. But that's not an identical question. So yeah.
Well, I also haven't heard this, for what it's worth. But that doesn't mean it's not the case.
Right.
I suspect that is a lender specific thing, right? The SBA has, the SBA programs have certain requirements, but the lenders have a lot of discretion. With a lot of those things. So,
can you guys give an example of a business license that is not transferable? We talked about transferability. Any examples come to mind?
I mean, I'm dealing with a liquor license for a restaurant right now that can't be transferred. So that would be one. What is you got permits? What's the environmental permit situation you have, Bill?
Yeah, right now we're looking at one that has the kind of manufacturing foundry type stuff, and they have to have certain like how they run their factory has to have certain environmental qualifications. And we're in the process of trying to determine whether or not we can transfer that or not, right? Like, or if we were to do an asset purchase, would we have to have a new inspector come in, do the whole rigmarole all over again? And that might change how we structure the deal, right? Because, you know, yeah, that's another example of something where, you know, it's very dependent on the actual permit, whether it can be transferred or not.
Great. if using a stock sale to retain a license, would an F reorg still keep that license retained? And maybe define for everybody what an F reorg is, please.
Yeah, so an F reorg is basically a tax reorganization that you do most commonly when the seller is an S corporation. It will allow you to buy the equity of that entity, but also to treat that purchase as if it is an asset sale for the purpose of depreciating the assets. So it's the most common way for you to buy an S corporation. So, and the answer is generally yes. You always kind of look at the same, you want to be looking at this, at the specific licenses, whatever. Sometimes you end up changing from like effectively into an LLC. And as long as the license is okay with certain of those transformations, then it should be fine. But that's not always the case. Because also F reorgs, this is getting really into the details, but F reorgs happen different ways depending on the type, on the exact type of entity that you're doing. And so that might have an effect on whether or not you can transfer the license. So anyway, we hate to say it depends, but again, it's an it depends sort of answer.
Does a seller equity rollover to facilitate the license still require the SBA PG even if the seller's rollover percentage is less than 20?
Not if it's less than 20.
So PG is not tied to whether or not they're a license holder. It's purely ownership levels.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Got some people asking about preschools and daycare centers, an asbestos abatement business, stock sale to keep. It could take up to 2 months with, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
Sometimes,
Sorry.
and sometimes with these, even if the license can be transferred, it takes time, right? Or it takes time to qualify for a new license. So that there can be times when, or there have been situations we've dealt with where people will choose a deal structure, they'll choose the stock sale, even if the asset sale would have worked, just out of pure desire for speed. Not the most common thing, right? But we have seen it.
Yeah.
And daycares can also be very, very state specific. And that's another one where, like, I wish we could give like a more concrete answer, but like they're very, very different state to state.
For $1 to $5 million deals, what are the pros and cons of having an escrow versus offsetting the seller note for breaches of representations? So I guess this is not related. This is a general question. Escrow versus offsetting this, a forgivable seller note for breaches.
So if the money is in escrow, then you can get the money a lot faster and you can get cash, right? If the money is in the form of forgiveness on the seller note, that is money that you don't have to pay, but that is not the same as additional money coming in, right? So if you have a forgivable seller note, it does not help a liquidity crisis, right? If there is an indemnification escrow of some kind, which again, not particularly common in these SBA transactions, but if there were an indemnity escrow, then that could be cash coming in to address a liquidity crisis. That's the biggest difference there.
I think there's also two other things. Number one is that escrow agents will often charge high fees. So I think we're did one deal where the escrow agent was charging a $10,000 fee. So if you have $100,000 escrow, query whether that's going to be worth it to pay $10,000 just as an escrow fee. The other thing to keep in mind with escrows is that you always have to have both sides sign off before you release that escrow. So if you get into a dispute with the seller about whether or not the escrow amount, like there's the indemnification claim is truly held, it's just sitting there in that escrow until both of you agree. And that's just how it is. And that's can kind of be a problem. If you have a note, you know, you can decrease the principal and just not pay them that. And then, you know, they have to more affirmatively sue you, and then you countersue them for saying that, you know, you have a claim, but it kind of puts more of the onus on the seller than with an escrow where both of you are kind of hostage to the fact that you have to agree before you do it, or get a final court order. But that's also,
and I will say, like, escrow for most of the transactions that anyone listening to this webinar will be doing, not going to be $10,000. That's a unique situation where there's multiple escrows for various things, and it's a bit of a mess. But that is not going to be your escrow cost if you're doing, you know, just a closing escrow, unless it is very, very large.
Yeah.
But make sure I understood your point, James David. But escrow, escrow is in the pro column for escrow, is it can mean money back to you.
Yes, right. Because with escrow, right, there is money sitting in an account somewhere.
Right. But couldn't you make the same argument that forgiving a seller note where you're forgiving is effectively money back to you because it's reducing your debt burden every month? So the $4,000 I was going to have to pay the seller, I now no longer do. You know, it's not an infusion of cash, but it's more cash than I thought I was going to be working with.
Right. But it doesn't solve a short-term liquidity crunch.
Right.
The way an influx of cash would.
Yeah.
Imagine, for instance, that suddenly you randomly had a $50,000 bill you had to pay that was undisclosed, and now it needs to be paid right away, right? You know, that's, you know, and if you offset the seller note for $5,000 per month for 10 months, you'll get there. But like, you know, what are you going to do?
You need cash now. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially if it's like a key vendor.
Right. Yeah. And keep in mind, well,
and that can happen. Those things can happen.
Yeah. And also keep in mind, a lot of seller notes are on standby for a number, often for 1 or 2 years following closing. So like you wouldn't have made many payments for them during that period anyway. So,
yeah.
You know, like how much liquidity, like what is the difference in liquidity? It's like, well, you're going to make less payments 2 years from now. It's like, oh, great. You know?
Yeah. Good point.
But again, indemnification escrows are not especially common in search or, you know, SBA transactions.
They're much more common. Well, especially networking capital escrows are very, very common once you start getting into the more of the middle market.
Have you dealt with the mechanics of closing a transaction where the licenses were required to transfer to new ownership when the then that transfer takes weeks or months to occur because, for example, the state regulatory agency needs to approve, but it's bureaucracy, there's backlog, takes forever. What are ways to, so everybody's operating in good faith, seller, you, but it's just mired in bureaucracy and you're waiting on the government. What are the ways to mitigate those types of situations? And plug for a future episode, one of my guests had such a situation in Atlanta, waiting GC license, had to wait 9 or 10 months as the Georgia state, whatever regulatory body issued him his new license. It worked out, but it was incredibly anxiety inducing for those months.
I mean,
as you can imagine.
Yeah. The one way to do it is to hold, right? Is to not close until it happens. Right. That's sort of one extreme. Is to not close until the transfer goes through. The other extreme would be to go ahead and close and just trust that it will. Now, I've seen both of those things happen. I'm not sure that I would do either one. There's sort of stuff in the middle, which is kind of more likely. Bill, you want to talk about TSAs a little bit?
Yeah, we could talk about that. you want to talk about transition services, where basically what you can do is the surviving entity depends a little bit how the license is set up, but you can have a transition services agreement between either the seller and or the seller principal and the entity and the new entity where they are operating for certain purposes, the business, and that can bridge the gap for the period where you're still waiting for whatever like approvals to happen that are going to happen.
So like customers would still be interfacing with the seller entity, but then you have agreements on the back end to where like you're paying the employees, right?
Right.
And you're getting the money.
You're getting the profits.
So right there can be agreements. And this is common, right? This sort of transition services agreement or TSA is very common in sort of larger transactions where it's like, okay, well, the seller is going to keep paying the employees health benefits for another 3 months post close or things like that. But you could have one in these smaller situations to address a license issue where, again, the seller would continue to operate, but on the back end, right, it's really the buyer who's getting the benefits.
You know, it's funny. Actually, I during my Wall Street days, I dealt with this issue. This is also in Atlanta, but related to one of the restaurants that you'll see if you're in the Atlanta airport. And literally the deal got held up for, I want to say like 2 months, trying to schedule a meeting to meet with like whatever council people there were in Atlanta to approve it. And like they were shelling out tons of money to this like consultant who basically was like a friend to like go to the councilman and say like, please, sir, will you finally like look at my issue and like give the stamp you need in order to transfer this like, thing at this airport. And so it's a real issue. And honestly, like sometimes you end up seeing, some pushing involved in terms of like hiring consultants and getting in front of government officials, but that's probably a little bit more on the high end than what you're likely to find in a searcher.
But say more about that, Bill, because in the story that I just referenced, which hasn't been published yet, he also had worked with some sort of consultant. So I guess they're consultants who claim to be able to facilitate this, interfacing with the government to facilitate the licensing process. He also had such a firm or person who, of course, then reported back, "Oh my God, I've never seen anything like this. What George is doing here. This is just unprecedented and horrible." But anyway, so what is that? That's not a lawyer. Who are these consultants who do this?
These are people that are friends with the people in power.
Seriously?
Relatives. Yeah.
Not always.
What do you Google to find person other than, conduit for bribes? No, I mean, that sounds so shady.
Now, I mean, often it is people who have been in the industry, right, or maybe even sat on these regulatory bodies in the past. It is sort of that, revolving door scenario of the way lobbyists work. Right, because in some sense, that's what these people are.
And oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say the other funny thing is like you might think like, oh well, this only happens in something. We've seen some where it's like it's a niche regulatory issue for there's like a very small state regulatory body and there's like a guy or like two guys that just know people that can talk to them and has been in the industry a long time, and like we've seen searcher deals where like they've had to consider like talking to those guys who say that they can get this specific approval that you need. So like, don't necessarily think that you won't encounter this issue, even at a searcher level.
Wow. What a gig those guys have. Dubious, but cushy.
Yeah.
Okay. Deal where a seller is the qualifying party and license holder. Seller wants to remain in the business for over 5 years, doesn't want equity, doesn't want to hold a note. There might be a little bit of equity or note to meet lender requirements, but it's not really motivating the seller. What other mechanisms do you recommend to ensure continuity and maintenance of licensing in good standing until I, buyer, searcher, can obtain my own license, which will take 2 years? So if it's not note, if it's not equity, seller stays in the business as an employee of the business. Is this just a renting situation where you juice the salary a little bit?
So, I mean, if they're going to stay more than a year, right, you can't do a total buyout under the SBA rules. Right, that actually is a requirement. So you're going to have to do a little bit of roll, but there may need to, yeah. I mean, sometimes it is just retention bonus cash to ensure a bridge that you get across a bridge. Yeah. And that can be that way with key employees too, right? Sometimes it is just a retention bonus style payment.
This one also feels like the seller, if it, presumably you, buyer, are doing this deal because you don't think the seller is shady and can be trusted. And if so, this seems like, most sellers want to see their legacy continue. If it's a good person, they want to see their legacy continue. They want to do right by their employees, especially if they're going to be working in the business as well. So the kind of all of that should be even stronger in this case. I mean, it just just make it clear to the seller, like all of this whole thing falls apart if you walk.
But I will say, like, just based on what little I know from this, what you said about the question, I have some follow-up questions that I would want to ask the seller, because some of that story is not the normal story.
That they're so uninterested in doing a seller note or in equity.
Well, that they want to keep going but not have ownership anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that, that's not a common thing.
Yeah. No, it's not. Great.
I think another thing to keep in mind is that there is some degree of difference when you are the one that is rolling up your sleeves and getting that license, because if you are on the ground doing everything and you need them to be the license holder, but not that you don't really need them for as much more than being the license holder, that relationship is generally easier to maintain because it doesn't really cost the seller too much of their time and attention. If, on the other hand, you really do need their expertise in order to run the business, that's a different story. Because, a lot of times sellers get checked out. You have to presume that sellers get pretty checked out, right? Even if they say they're going to be involved in the business. And so my operational question is, like, how much, besides actually having the license to technically do the thing, how much do you really actually need their expertise on what to do? Because if you still need their expertise on what to do, I would still be a little concerned, because a lot of times sellers end up going, they got a payday and they get a little lazy and that type of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point. I just heard a story about that before this call of sellers basically losing interest, even though they were made noise to the contrary before the transaction. So
that can happen after an equity roll too, right? So
it's not a guarantee that they're going to be. Yeah.
Guys, I think this is a question just for how you work. Do you have a pre-LOI flat fee, reviewing an LOI, or assisting in the crafting of one? That, I guess, so maybe use this as an opportunity to get a little bit more granular about how you work, the process, the milestones.
Yeah, so with that, we're actually trying to launch resources to make it a little bit easier. So we have a template that we give out for free to everybody. We do have a webinar where we talk about sort of how that's created. We are planning on creating a video which will sort of in-depth go through that. The reason we say that is because we do love meeting with everybody as much as possible. We do also get a lot of requests. And so if you feel like you're still sort of stumbling and lost, you can continue to reach out to us and say, like, hey, I really would like my help just kind of as a consultation to refine this process. And then we're happy to, we take it on a case-by-case basis just because we have so many. And we generally just kind of do that as, at least right now, no promises in the future, but at least right now, we often do that as just a free consult, kind of get to know the person. But we can't do that with everybody because at this point, we've kind of gotten a little bit overwhelmed with LOI, those type of requests. So we do usually send out, here's information, here's our LOI, here's some video resources on how to fill it out. And for most people, that kind of gets them to where they need to be. But if you still really feel like you need help with stuff, you can continue to reach out and we'll often schedule a call.
Yeah, and where we do come in, where we like to come in, our favorite point to come in is after you've used our template, you've submitted an LOI and you've gotten feedback on that LOI. That's often the point when we get engaged as a law firm to help you is when you've gotten feedback, because it's possible as a searcher or a sponsor, you're going to send out a lot of LOIs. Some people send out way too many, but that's a different story. But you're going to send out multiple LOIs, and the one that actually gets signed, right? Sellers don't just sign LOIs very much, especially if there's a broker involved. There's going to be some negotiation. And so we like to be involved in that negotiation to help make sure the deal works for SBA requirements, or that you truly address all of the main points of the deal so that you actually have a deal, and that you just have a structure that you understand and the seller understands. And then we'll take you from that point all the way to close. Right, a typical engagement right now for us has 3 milestones for our searchers and sponsors. There can be 4, depending on whether there's investors involved, but typically we have 3 milestones right now. The first is kind of the start of the engagement, which is meant to cover finalizing the LOI and legal diligence. We're happy to talk to you after you have a signed LOI also, right? You don't have to talk to us before an LOI. I'd rather talk to you when the LOI is being negotiated, but people come to us with signed LOIs. That's perfectly fine. But that first bit is to finalize the LOI and legal diligence. But really with the legal diligence, we kind of let financial diligence play out, frankly, before we really kick in to overdrive on legal diligence. If everything gets through financial diligence, legal diligence, everything's looking good, operational diligence is coming back clean, you say, all right, James, David, and Bill, it's time to draft all the documents. All right, there's sort of we describe it as a go, no go decision or a green light. And that's our second milestone. And at that point, we'll draft whatever documents are needed for the transaction. And then we'll negotiate those with whoever needs to be, with the seller, with investors, with employees, et cetera. And then our third milestone is closing that's sort of the typical pattern right now for a buy-side engagement.
Excellent. Thanks, James David. Okay, I'm going to do one last question for you guys and then let everybody go. This one is specific, but not to a state, more about structuring a deal. I'm reviewing a company that leverages licenses from OEMs, intellectual property, for branded products that are then sold. These licenses, OEM licenses, renew every 2 to 3 years, posing a risk that they get pulled before the loan is paid back. Any considerations on structure to mitigate this risk and align incentives?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a little bit tricky with what the lender's okay with. It's going to be a little bit tricky in what the seller's okay with, right? You could structure things so that there are effectively contingent payments based on those licenses, the existing licenses continuing.
Right.
But there are limits to what you can do in SBA if you are indeed in an SBA scenario. If you're not in an SBA scenario, you can get a lot more creative. But within the SBA, there's still probably some things you can do in terms of, conditional seller note elements, but it would have to be worded in particular ways, and your lender is going to have to sign off on it.
Another thing I'll just mention here, because sometimes things can get confusing. A lot of the licenses we've been talking about here is, government licenses to do certain things. There's also licenses in the sense of like being licensed to use somebody's intellectual property, which is, kind of a separate matter. But just since we were still using the phrase licenses, I just want to make sure like they're kind of separate
And
issues.
those are almost certainly not going to be assignable.
Yeah.
So you're probably looking at an equity purchase, and almost certainly.
Yeah.
Any big company, any OEM, right, any Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 company, right, good luck getting that contract assigned. So.
Fantastic, guys. We're just about to wrap up, everybody. Here in the chat is how you can get in touch if you missed the links earlier. There is Barlow and Williams' website and James, David, and Bill's emails and LinkedIn. Connect with them, shoot them an email. There were questions that we didn't get to that were pretty specific. I won't speak for him, but he did just say that he always answers. So you're likely to get an email from James David. So I hope I haven't over promised there for you, James David. Not a ton of such questions, but if you're one of those questioners, of course, if you don't hear from him, just email him. Any last thoughts, guys, or should we wrap?
I think we should wrap it up. Well, thanks again, Will. We always love being here. So.
You guys do such a great job. These are always so informative. Everybody, thank you for your attention. Watch for next month's office hours. We'll be announcing that in the next few weeks, so keep an eye out for that. Check out James, David, and Bill's past webinars on the Acquiring Minds website under webinars, under legal. You'll find all 9 there, and this one will be posted in the next 24 hours. And watch your inboxes for a recording, for this recording, as well as the deck. Link to the deck. And with that, this concludes the webinar. Thank you, everyone.